At my granddaughter's wedding, I realized I was just the ATM. Now they beg for my forgiveness. At my granddaughter's wedding, I realized something. To them, I was no longer a grandmother. I was just a walking wallet. They sat me by the bar, right where the air conditioner blasted my back for 3 straight hours. No one asked if I was cold. No one asked if I needed anything. When my granddaughter gave her speech, she thanked her parents, her friends, even the entire planning crew, but not the person who paid for the whole thing. That was me. In that moment, I understood just how out of place I was at that lavish celebration. And now, after everything, they're the ones begging for forgiveness. My name is There's Caldwell, 74 years old. I live alone in a little wooden house on the outskirts of Bend, Oregon. I'm not the kind of woman who talks about what she does for her family. I don't hang up certificates.
I don't keep receipts.
Even though for nearly 2 years, I covered every single expense from the engagement party to the wedding itself. Leah, my only granddaughter, Gregory's daughter. I used to think that if I just quietly supported them, they'd understand that I didn't need gratitude, just the joy of seeing them happy. But standing in that crowd, I finally saw the truth. If you never speak up, people start thinking your giving is automatic. And a woman who spent her whole life sacrificing can somehow become an ATM without even noticing. Have you ever felt that when you give your time, your money, your pride, and all you get back is a wedding invitation with no thank you? I have. And I stayed silent until I couldn't anymore. I stayed silent until that thankless invitation landed in my hand, like the final drop in an already full cup. It wasn't just an invitation.
It was a sign.
They sent me a wedding invitation with no handwritten note, no message, just my name printed alone in a quiet corner. I picked it up from the old wooden floor right where the mailman usually slips letters through the front door every Wednesday morning. Thick cardstock, gold-trimmed, embossed. One of those fancy invitations meant for grand occasions. But nothing about the way they sent it to me felt grand. No greeting, no familiar handwriting, no little note tucked inside, just a cold line of print. Miss There's Caldwell is cordially invited to the wedding of Leah Caldwell and Jonathan Pierce. June 17th. I turned it over. Blank, no scroll of hope to see you there, Grandma. Nothing. Morning light poured into the kitchen, scattering flecks of gold across my hands. I set the card on the table and filled the kettle. The scent of dried lavender mingled with the quiet bitterness of black tea. What came in the mail? Rita stepped into the room, resting her cane against the chair, her silver hair pinned up neatly, just like always. She used to be a literature teacher, the kind who could read a line and know when someone was lying. I didn't answer right away. I just handed her the card. She read it once, then again.
No greeting, no signature.
Her voice sharpened. Didn't Leah always write you little notes by hand? I nodded gently. Maybe she's just busy with weddings, you know.
Sure.
Too busy to even write love, Leah. Rita sat across from me, stirring her tea, eyes fixed on mine. What about Gregory and Melinda? Have they called? I shook my head. Gregory texted a few weeks ago, asking for my bank account number. I tried to smile, saying he wanted to send money in case I needed a new dress for the wedding, and I told him not to bother. I already have a purple dress. Silence. Outside, the school bus crept past rows of maple trees. There's, Rita said softly. Are you sure they really want you there, or are they just following protocol? I looked down at my teacup, my hand trembling slightly. The water was still hot. I'm her grandmother, I said as if trying to remind myself. Her grandmother? The woman who paid Gregory's first business loan when he opened his law office.
Rito paused.
The one who stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks to care for Leah when Melinda was away on a business trip. I offered, I said quietly. And now they send you a wedding invitation with not one word of thanks. Rita dropped her spoon. The clang against the glass was sharp. They see you as an ATM. Nothing more. I stood, needing an excuse to step away from her gaze. I need to go to the post office. I have a cake order to send. Rita gave a small nod. Let's go. I'll come with you. The post office in Bend sits in an old red brick building beside the Sparrow Bakery. Outside, the smell of baking butter mixed with warm paper in the morning sun. Just another ordinary day. But inside me, something was stirring, slow, quiet, and heavy. After mailing the order, I stopped at Sparrow for a blueberry muffin. The red-haired cashier I see every weekend smiled. The usual, Miss Terrace? I nodded, a little grateful that at least someone somewhere still remembered my name, still noticed the small things. Back home, I brewed another pot of tea. Rita didn't speak, just watched as I came into the living room, holding a small wooden box from the upstairs shelf, Walter's box. I opened it. The hinges gave a soft sigh. Inside were letters, paper now the color of old cream, still bearing the deep blue ink of his hand. Walter never forgot a single occasion. Not Christmas, not birthdays, not even our wedding anniversary. Even if it was just a few lines, he always wrote something. My dearest Teasy, I thought of you when I read this article. Or, I dreamed of us dancing in the snow last night. I ran my fingers over the letters, and for the first time in months, I asked myself the question I'd always been afraid to face. If he were still alive, would I be pushed aside like this? I sat there for a long time, the box still open, listening to the wind slip through the window. There was no anger in my mind. None for Gregory, Melinda, or Leah. Only emptiness, a space that once held letters, tiny gifts, and Leah's hugs when she was little. Now only questions. I remembered the afternoon Gregory asked to borrow money to start his law firm. He hadn't even talked to Melinda first. Just showed up one late afternoon carrying a box of cold donuts and a hopeful look. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my savings book, wired the money, and said, "Just remember to thank your mother." And today, looking at that invitation, I wondered, does he even remember? Rita left after our afternoon tea. I walked her to the door. She paused on the porch step, hesitant to leave me alone. "Some people will remember you for what you've done," she said. "And some will only remember you as long as you're still the money. Knowing the difference doesn't make you weak. It just makes things clear." I nodded softly. "I know, but sometimes I wish I didn't have to know." She held me for a long moment, then left. I went back to the kitchen, wiped the wooden table, and returned the letter box to the shelf. Under the warm light, the tiny cracks on the tabletop became more visible, like the fine lines around my eyes. Leah didn't call. Gregory didn't text. One day passed, then another. The invitation still lay on the table like a foreign object that didn't belong to any of my family memories. I carried it up to my small study, the same room where I used to write letters, notes, and poems back when Walter was alive. I reached for the fountain pen, his gift for our 40th anniversary. The ink was still good, though the nib had dried slightly. I flipped the invitation over. Thick, smooth, expensive paper. As if money could stand in for affection, I took a deep breath, pressed the nib to paper, and wrote just one line. "I'll be there, and I'll be watching." That's what I wrote. And on the day of the wedding, that's exactly what I did. The first thing I saw was a seat next to a rattling air conditioner. I didn't have a seat in the family row. I sat by the humming air conditioner with a place card in front of me that read, "Primary Sponsor." The wedding hall smelled of pine wood and citrus oils. Soft jazz played in the background. White drapes flowed from the ceiling, forming a graceful canopy where Leah walked in, dressed in lace that hugged her frame just right. She looked beautiful in that modern, Instagram-worthy way. The kind of beauty designed to be admired. I hadn't planned to cry, but maybe a part of me had already shut down the moment the receptionist asked for my name, scanned her list for a while, and said, "Oh, you're at the sponsors table next to the DJ booth near the dessert bar." I nodded. No questions, no sadness, just a little cold, probably because the air conditioner was right behind me. My table mates were strangers, or names I vaguely recognized from Gregory's financial reports. A salt and pepper-haired man leaned over and asked politely, "Are you Teasy, the groom's mother?" I nodded quietly. "Yes." Then looked down at my water glass. "You're very generous," a woman in a yellow dress across from me said. "Covering the whole wedding for your son. It's rare these days. Only those in the industry understand it's quite the investment." I smiled but didn't answer. I remembered Rita's question. If you hadn't paid, would they have invited you at all? Back then, I thought she was being harsh. Now, it felt more like the truth. I sat upright, hands folded in my lap. The wedding followed every modern standard. A charming MC, soft background music, white wine flowing steadily. Gregory spoke first. Melinda followed, thanking friends, colleagues, parents, everyone who supported our journey into marriage. No one mentioned me. Not that I needed praise. I've always been the woman in the background, unseen but steady. I never lived for applause, but I never imagined my absence could be this silent. After the ceremony, I was about to quietly slip away when a red-haired girl pulled up a chair beside me. "I was in Leia's MBA class," she said. "Heard a lot about you. The grandma who really came through. This resort's fancier than my honeymoon spot." I pressed my lips together. Her words weren't meant to insult, but they didn't carry respect either. A staff member in a white uniform stepped in to refill my water. I murmured thanks, then looked out into the garden where Leia was posing with her bridesmaids. Melinda's dress stood out in the background, and her eyes scanned the area, checking off items in her mental checklist. I used to be that woman, the one who wanted every detail perfect, from the chair bows to the lighting for the photos. But I never would have seated my mother by the air conditioner. Never. Melinda came to my table as dessert was being served. She wore a pale beige silk dress, elegantly cut, her face carefully made up, as she always was at the events Gregory invited me to. Events where I was always seated near the exit or beside the restroom. "Terry's," she said, leaning in, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder like a formality. "Everything's just wonderful. All thanks to our generous mother-in-law, of course." I looked up and met her eyes. "If everything truly is wonderful," I said slowly, "then I'm glad." She gave a light laugh, the kind that never reaches the eyes, then left as quickly as she came. I don't think she cared where I sat, what I ate, or how I felt. She surely didn't notice that my chair had a broken leg, and I had to lean sideways every time I cut a bite of cheesecake. The late afternoon sun filtered through the pine trees outside. The wedding was drawing to a close. At the table beside mine, a group of guests began whispering loud enough for me to hear. "Whose mother is she again?" "Not sure. I thought she was with the sponsors." "No, someone said she's Gregory's mom, but from the way they're treating her, who knows?" I turned my glass slowly, fingers trembling just slightly. A woman nearly 75 years old, a mother for over 4 decades, being mistaken for a logistics assistant. I didn't blame them. I blamed myself for placing myself here among strangers and still calling it family. I had thought love would be enough, but it seems love doesn't earn a seat at the wedding unless it comes with money. I stood up and stepped out into the small garden behind the hall. No one noticed. No one called my name. I was just another quiet detail, like the fine print at the bottom of a sponsorship agreement. I sat on an iron bench near the fountain. The breeze brushed past, carrying with it laughter and music from inside. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. Then came the soft sound of heels on stone. Leia. She had thrown a shawl over her wedding dress. Her hair loosened from its earlier bun. She looked tired but beautiful in that youthful, camera-ready way, always catching the light just right. She bent toward me and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Grandma. I'll send you all the receipts after the honeymoon, okay?" I stood up, leaving behind the shards of a trust that had quietly shattered. Less than a day later, the sound of my phone pulled me back into a harsher reality. Another request from Gregory. Gregory called just as I'd set the kettle on the stove, but he didn't ask if I'd made it home safely. He asked, "When are you planning to transfer the remaining amount?" I paused for 2 beats before answering, not because the signal was bad, but because I was trying to find the invisible shoes I'd somehow lost, the ones labeled, "I'm your mother," not an ATM. "Lila already told you," I replied. "I'll review the invoices later." "But you agreed to fund the whole thing," Gregory said, his voice flat, like he was reading off a spreadsheet. "I just need to schedule payment with the wedding planner." I could hear the air conditioner humming slowly and the kettle beginning to tick toward a boil. Gregory didn't ask if I'd eaten dinner. He didn't ask how my back was after the long ceremony. "I think I should rest a few days," I said, keeping my voice even. You just leave everything for now. I'll look at it next week. Mom, let's not complicate things. We already agreed. I ended the call as the kettle began to whistle. Not out of anger, but because if I spoke another word, I would bend again. And I've bent far too often over the past 30 years. I poured hot water into my teacup. My hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of Gregory's words. Words spoken so lightly, yet they pressed on my chest like stone. I sat at the kitchen table and pulled out a folder from the bottom drawer. Manila files, asset indexes, power of attorney documents, notes Walter once scribbled by hand. In an older file, I found a copy of the 2016 power of attorney, the one I remembered sharing with only one person besides my lawyer, Gregory. He'd said, "Let me keep a copy just in case the bank needs to verify our family assets." And I believed him. I always believed that my son would never treat me like a piece of property to be managed. I held the paper, my finger pausing at the signature line. Walter never believed in emotional transactions. He always prepared for the worst. He used to say, "If I'm gone one day, you must have the final say. No one should be able to push you around." I looked over at his photo on the shelf taken one autumn afternoon deep in the aspen woods. He wore his old khaki jacket, a half smile on his face. The way he leaned slightly toward me, as if ready to catch me if I fell. I opened my laptop and searched for an old email from Ethan Morrow, Walter's closest friend. Ethan had co-managed the trust Walter set up for me after his death. "Ethan," I typed. "I need to talk as soon as possible." Less than 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A message from him. "I assume you've discovered Gregory still has that old power of attorney." I replied, "And I'm not sure what rights I even have left." Ethan answered, "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., I'll bring the appendix Walter drafted. Maybe it's finally time to use it." I set the phone down, leaned back in my chair, and sat in the soft yellow light of the kitchen. Summer nights in Bend aren't as cold as they used to be, but inside me, it felt like mid-December. I stepped into the living room. Walter's wooden box still sat under the bottom shelf of the bookcase. I opened the lid. The scent of old paper and the peppermint oil he once used to keep the leather fresh still lingered. His letters, bundled with gray silk ribbons, were written since 1982. I ran my hands over the stacks to terrace. Our first winter apart. The day I got the job in Colorado. The day you gave birth to Gregory. You were stronger than anyone I've ever known. I didn't read them. I just needed to see his handwriting. The way he wrote my name with care. As if every wrong stroke might hurt me. I used to think these memories would be my refuge when the world felt too wide, too cold. But tonight, I realized I can't live inside the past forever. I closed the box. And in that fleeting moment, I heard Walter's voice, not from a letter, but from memory. "TZ, someday you'll have to choose to stand up, not just stand behind." I walked over to the desk, switched on the lamp, and reached for another file, the one with our joint accounts, the savings, the stocks Walter had left me. Most of it was under the trust co-signed by Ethan. I had never touched it. Gregory had always urged me to liquidate it slowly. Easier to track, he said. And I had let it happen for years. I wrote a new list, withdrawals over the past 5 years. Gregory's payment requests from home repairs, car purchases to Leia's tuition. In the next column, I wrote, "Did I sign this?" More than half read, not sure. I set my pen down. In the kitchen mirror, hazy in the dim light, I saw a woman with silver hair brushing her shoulders, eyes no longer angry, just tired. I asked myself, not aloud, how did I let it go this far? And then I whispered as a quiet but steady declaration. I never said no for 30 years, but that doesn't mean I can't learn. I closed the notebook. Tomorrow morning, I'd meet Ethan. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Ethan. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m. I'll bring the appendix Walter prepared. It's probably time." I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I smiled just a little, not from joy, but from the feeling that finally the decision was mine. That feeling of finally making a choice, even just to reply to Ethan's message, sparked a flicker of hope inside me. When I arrived at his studio, the smell of old coffee and paperwork greeted me, along with a secret Walter had been keeping all along. Walter wrote 2 wills, one for the family and one just for me. I never expected the day would come when I'd have to open such a letter. Ethan waited for me at his studio, a converted pottery shop once filled with clay and glazes, now a cluttered but warm little office. The scent of old coffee mingled with paper and lacquered wood. Sunlight poured in from the high windows, casting soft shadows on the dark wooden floors, the same floors where Walter once leaned unfinished frames against the walls. Ethan didn't say much. He simply slid a dark brown envelope across the table toward me. "He left this," he said. "He told me only to give it to her when she's been pushed to the edge. And I think that time has come." I didn't open it right away. My hand rested on the envelope, my finger tracing the ink of my name, theirs and Caldwell, in Walter's handwriting. The same gentle slant he always used on Christmas cards. When he was still here, I didn't ask Ethan anything more. I just held the envelope and left, like someone who'd been handed back a piece of their soul. The house felt darker than usual. Or maybe I just saw it differently now. I changed into an old cardigan, brewed a pot of peppermint tea, and went upstairs. The wooden box where I kept Walter's old letters sat in the bottom drawer of my bedside table. I placed the new letter beside the ones he'd written me through the years. But this time I opened it. "My dearest Teasy, if you're reading this, you're probably feeling alone. But you're never truly alone." I read in silence. Each letter was deliberate, firm, careful. Walter explained that during the final year of his life, when his illness became undeniable, he drafted a second appendix, a separate will, not because he didn't trust Gregory, but because he worried that our son might be swept up in things he couldn't understand. Worried that one day I would be forced to choose between family and dignity. He made it clear all decisions regarding the estate were to be mine, and nothing would pass to the children unless I chose to allow it. No vague clauses, no room for pressure or persuasion. I folded the letter, my hand trembling, not from fear, but from the feeling of being lifted from the bottom of something heavy and deep, not by anyone else, but by the one who had once left me behind. I called the lawyer, Mr. Peterson, the one who worked with Walter in those final years. When I read out the appendix code, he paused, then confirmed. "It's still legally binding, theirs. And yes, you're the sole authority. Gregory has no access to any assets without your signature." I can't remember the last time I sat upright without bracing for disappointment. But then I sat tall. No one in my family knew this appendix existed. They only knew the version of Tess, who always nodded, always yielded, always paid. They didn't know Walter had seen me, really seen me, as someone worth protecting, not just someone to hold everything together. I opened a drawer, pulled out the old file, the power of attorney document Gregory had copied in 2018. I tore it in half. Then I signed the cancellation form, each stroke deliberate, steady hand. I scanned it and sent it to the lawyer and to Ethan. I had never felt so in charge. Not the kind of power that commands, but the kind that says I have the right to be silent or not. I have the right to keep what I've built without being told I should give it away simply because I'm old. That night, I didn't turn on the kitchen light. I left only the desk lamp glowing. I poured myself another cup of tea, now cool, and listened to the wind brushing against the window as if Walter were sitting beside me again. Then, my computer screen lit up. A new email from Gregory. Subject: Leia needs money to finish honeymoon in Iceland. Can you help this last time? I read it, then read it again. My hand hovered over the mouse, but I didn't click because this time I had learned how to say no. Even though my hand touched the mouse, I never clicked reply. It was a gentle no, but strong enough to change the course of my life. My birthday came. No calls, no messages. But I'd found something else. A quiet kind of joy, a reason to keep going, rooted in the simplest of things. This year, I didn't celebrate my birthday. No one called, but I still baked the vanilla peach cake Walter used to make and lit a single candle. Not for anyone to make a wish with me, but to remind myself I still have something to live for. As the cake went into the oven, the scent of melting butter and ripe peaches filled the kitchen. I stood by the oven door, fingers resting on a striped cloth, and thought, how long had it been since I last made this? The recipe was still tucked into the old notebook on the top left shelf of the cupboard. Walter had written it in his usual bold, right-leaning script with a red ink note at the bottom. Add vanilla while it's still warm. Like love, timing is everything. No candles, no music, no flowers. But when I cut the first slice, I smiled to myself. Not because I was happy, but because for the first time in many years, I had chosen to do something just for me. A week after my birthday, I signed up for a memoir writing class called Stories and Images at the community studio near Pilot View Park. At first, I thought I'd just listen. But then I saw the people sitting beside me, each one with a box of photos, some faded notebooks, and a story they'd never dared to tell. I realized maybe it was time I opened up. Clarence Yates, a man in his 80s, sat beside me. He was thin, his old jacket worn at the shoulders, but his voice was still strong. He told us that after returning from the war, his daughter once called him a burden. Since then, he'd lived alone. That little girl didn't know her father wrote letters from the battlefield every day, Clarence said, eyes fixed somewhere distant. I never sent them, but I wrote. I nodded gently. I understood that feeling of wanting to speak, but never quite daring. Our assignment that day was to write a letter you'll never send. I stared at the blank page for a long time. Then I began. I didn't write to Gregory. I didn't write to Leah. I wrote to myself. To the woman I was 30 years ago, the one who folded away her college degree, left her job for her husband, and later followed her children. You did everything with the hope that someone would remember, I wrote. But life doesn't hand out rewards just because you lived it right. As the evening fell, I walked through the park with Rita and Clarence. Maple leaves, red and orange, blanketed the paths. The air was crisp, as if autumn, too, understood the quiet ache of loneliness. Rita held my hand as I told her about the cake. She said nothing, just squeezed gently. Clarence slowed his pace to let us walk ahead. When I got home, there was an envelope in my mailbox.
No stamp.
Someone had delivered it by hand. It was a printed sheet, a family gathering invitation. Saturday, 5 p.m., Three Pines Restaurant. At the bottom, Gregory's signature. Nothing else. I handed the paper to Rita. A trap, she said immediately. Maybe another ask for money. Maybe to pressure you into signing something. I sat down, placing the old wedding invitation next to this new one. I looked at Rita. It's all right, I said quietly. I'm going this time, but not as the same woman. That evening, I returned to the writing class. The small room glowed with warm light. Older faces, each with their own soft smile, filled the space. Each person placed something on the table, a photograph, a keepsake, a memory they'd never named aloud. I opened my notebook, quietly turned to a blank page, and I began to write. Not for anyone else, not to forgive anyone, but to remind myself what I had walked through and why I could never go back. I forgive, but I don't forget. That's what I wrote. No embellishments, no explanations, no blame, just one line like a compass. I read it aloud, softly, just loud enough for myself to hear. A woman beside me, her name was Joy, placed a hand on my shoulder after I closed the notebook. She said, "We don't write so others will read. We write so we won't repeat the silence that broke us." I stayed long after the class ended, watching streetlights spill across the window, watching the elderly walk home slowly with their canes in quiet. And I thought, how many of them had been called a burden? How many had paid with silence, with a life lived for others? I don't know, but I know on me, and I've begun to change. The next morning, I asked Clarence to walk with me along the creek behind the studio. Dry leaves cracked beneath our feet. A soft breeze stirred a few into the air, like memories unwilling to rest. Clarence told me that before losing contact with his daughter, he had once planned to sketch their old house, the one he was born in. But I was afraid I'd draw it with anger, not memory, he said, eyes distant. I looked at him and said softly, "Next week, I'm going to paint my childhood home." the way I want to remember it. He nodded. We kept walking, saying nothing more, and we didn't need to. We kept walking, each step steadier than the last. I no longer feared facing what lay ahead. So when that family gathering invitation came, I knew it was time to face those who once dismissed me. But this time, I would not arrive as the woman they used to know. I arrived at the family meeting right on time. Leah was seated behind her laptop, the spreadsheet already open. Gregory asked, "So, which part would you like to support, Mom?" Their living room felt more like a small office than a home. White walls still bare, a cold glass table, ceiling lights too bright. Melinda sat with her legs crossed, holding an iPad. Leah had the Excel file open, each cell color-coded, green for paid, yellow for needs additional support. I sat on the stiff leather chair beside the table, slowly unwrapped my shawl, steadying my hands. Not from fear, but because for the first time I had chosen to sit here as someone different. Gregory didn't ask how I'd been. Didn't ask if I traveled safely or felt tired. He just stared at the spreadsheet. "There's a discount on the condo in the Pearl District if we place a deposit soon. I think with your help, Leah could finally feel settled." I smiled and looked slowly at all three of them. "Gregory," I said, "I've been investing for 30 years, investing in all of you through homes, tuition, hospital bills, cars, even those stretches when you were unemployed and didn't tell Melinda." Gregory fell silent. Melinda looked up. "You said you would help. You made a promise." I nodded. "I did, but promises aren't life sentences. They can change. When a person realizes they've walked too far alone, with no one ever turning back," Leah spoke softly, eyes never leaving her screen. "You used to be the only one who made me feel loved. Are you taking that away?" I looked at my granddaughter, the same girl I once rocked to sleep while Walter hummed in the backyard. "I still love you, Leah, but I'm no longer a walking wallet." I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope. No cash, no account details, just a new will along with documentation transferring my remaining assets to a new foundation called Walter and Friends. Gregory picked it up, his brow furrowing. "A community fund," he asked. "Why didn't you talk to me about this?" I placed my hand on the table, firm, calm. "Because this is the first thing in my life I've ever done without asking anyone's permission." Melinda stood. "So this is you walking away from the family?" I looked at her. "No, this is me walking back to myself." She turned away, hiding her eyes behind her perfectly straightened hair. Gregory didn't speak again, just lowered his head. And I saw it clearly. What surprised him wasn't that I said no. It was that I wasn't afraid to lose my place at that table anymore. Leah sat still, her hand rested on the mouse, unmoving. After a moment, she whispered, "I didn't know you were that sad." I smiled softer than I had in years. "That's the thing. No one asked, but I don't blame you, sweetheart. It's just some sadness, shouldn't have to be swallowed for a lifetime." The room grew quiet. No arguments, no shouting, just a silence heavier than any ordinary meeting. I stood slowly and gathered my things. No one walked me to the door, but I didn't need them to. I stepped outside, and summer was gone. Leaves were beginning to turn gold at the edges of a lawn. There was wind, gentle but undeniable. I took a deep breath. Not everyone needs to say sorry to me, but I don't need their apology to keep living. I whispered it to myself. That afternoon, I returned to the community studio. A group of volunteers was putting up a new sign above the entrance, black lettering on oak wood, "Walter and Friends Center. A new beginning after 70. I stood beneath it, looking up into the sunlight. A leaf drifted down onto my shoulder. I didn't brush it off. I stepped inside. The room was open and bright. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air. My classmates waved. Clarence was checking the student roster. Rita brought in a tin of homemade butter cookies. No one asked me about money. No one needed me to survive. But here I mattered. I smiled. The first class began, and I was the one who opened the door. I never went back to Gregory's house. In fact, I didn't even keep the new address. After that meeting, I returned home, sat in the armchair by the window, the one where Walter used to read in the late afternoons, and opened a notebook I'd never written in. A blank page, a beginning that belonged to no one but me. The next afternoon, I returned to the community center. The old sign was still there, but now with a wooden plaque underneath, Walter and Friends Center. A new beginning after 70. I didn't write that line to sound hopeful or to attract attention. I wrote it because I had lived it. Clarence arrived early. He brought 2 new brushes, a box of paints, and a fresh notebook. "I think I'll try a poem today," he said, his voice still gruff but softer at the edges. I smiled. "Then I'll try painting, even though I'm awful at it." We sat side by side like 2 kids in a summer workshop. No need to explain much, just quietly sharing time. The others in class, most well into their 70s, didn't talk much either. But I noticed their eyes had changed. Some who once said, "My kids are too busy," had begun sharing stories of what they were learning and writing. They wrote letters to themselves, to those who had passed, to children who no longer called. Some wrote to the future, to a place where they believed they still mattered. A week later, Clarence asked me to walk up Pilot Butte with him. The incline was steep, but he didn't complain, and neither did I. Halfway up, he stopped and looked out over the little town below. "Tez," he said, "do you think people like us could walk this path together, growing old?" I looked at him and didn't answer right away. Clarence wasn't Walter, and I was no longer a woman in her 30s seeking romance or repair. But maybe after enough hurt and enough silence, what we need is simply someone who will walk beside us without questions, without leaving halfway. That night, I wrote a letter to myself. The first since Walter passed. I didn't cry. I just wrote, "I used to think love was sacrifice, but true love is when you no longer have to prove you're worth it." A month later, I cleared out some of the old things in my home. Not to throw them away, but to make space for something new, or maybe just room to breathe. The fridge, once stocked with Gregory and Leia's favorites, now held a few vegetables, some milk, and the vanilla peach cake I baked every weekend. I no longer cooked for compliments. I cooked to remember that I'm still here. Clarence brought over a small wooden table and chairs. "I made this back in the military," he said. "Never gave it to anyone. But maybe it belongs here now." We placed it in the backyard on afternoons after class. We sat there with peach tea, talking about things no one asks in a lifetime: the ache of being forgotten, the quiet of going to doctor's appointments alone, the joy of finding yourself again. One day, Ethan stopped by. He brought a stack of papers. The community fund was officially active. Walter's name and mine were engraved on the bronze plaque out front. I stared at that plaque longer than I thought I would, not out of regret, but wondering if Walter were still here. Would he be surprised that I made it this far? Gregory never reached out again. No one from their side came to visit. I thought I'd feel sad, maybe regretful, but it turns out silence can be its own kind of freedom. Because not everyone has to apologize for us to forgive. And not every forgiveness needs a reply. That Christmas, I hosted a small gathering at the center. Nothing fancy, just a few old friends, a few songs, and the vanilla peach cake baked once more. Clarence read a poem he wrote for those no longer invited to the family table, but who still remember how to fold napkins for others. I stood beside him, held his hand as he read the last lines. That hand, not as strong as Walter's, but warm, and it didn't pull away. As people were leaving, an older woman from class took my hand and whispered, "Thank you for helping me remember. I can still begin again." I nodded, said nothing, because women like her and people like her had helped me keep going, too, in ways no words could describe. Someone once told me, at a certain age, you stop wanting to win. You just want to be seen, heard, believed. I understand that now, not with my mind, but with sunlit afternoons, small classrooms, and the eyes of those long overlooked. I used to think love meant giving endlessly. But now I know if we don't learn to preserve ourselves, even those we love most can turn away. Forgiveness doesn't mean silent acceptance. And growing up doesn't end when your hair turns gray. It begins the moment you say, "That's enough." If you've ever felt small or overlooked, remember this. You are like that old coat that once kept the whole family warm through the winter. And once the chill fades, they may forget. But that doesn't make you any less valuable. It just means it's time to keep yourself warm. And if this story touched something in you, share it. Because someone out there might be waiting to hear exactly this.